So thank you for being here and joining me today to talk about something that I really feel passionate about and honored to be speaking on. So my name is Pam Lanhart, and I consider myself a person in recovery from the effects of the disease of addiction. And what that means is that in spite of the fact that I was raised in a family with substance use disorder, had siblings, had a son, that I was able to heal and live my best life. And so I can show up for my family. My husband and I have been married 41 years. We have 3 living children. I'll tell a little bit about, just a tiny bit about my son as we walk through this. And unfortunately, after several years in recovery, he passed away last year of an accidental fentanyl overdose. And then, of course, I get to show up for my community, and my greatest passion was born out of my need to find the services that we now offer in the state of Minnesota. So our organization, I'm just a little bit about me. Nationally certified family recovery coach, ARISE trained interventionist and comprehensive care coordinator, CRAFT, community reinforcement and family training practitioner, which I think is the bomb if you're not familiar with it, and then invitation to change practitioner. So everything we do in our organization is person-centered, holistic, and invitational, which is changing the conversation around how families are interacting with their loved ones when they present with the symptoms of substance use. We founded Thrive Family Recovery Resources back in 2016, and just a quick little bit about that story. So I had a daughter who struggled with mental health issues, and I had a son who struggled with substance use issues. And when my daughter was 12 and she was self-harming, she went to the guidance counselor's office, and she was able to talk to them, and they called us and they were like, do you want to come in? We'll have a meeting. I think she needs some extra services. We got an IEP. We got brochures. We got, warm handoffs to therapists. And when my son presented with substance use disorder, he got suspended. And we were shamed as a family. And you know how it is, right? The stigma that goes along with addiction. And what we got was just go to a meeting. And then we got all the phrases, detach, let go, do this tough love thing. My son was 15 years old. We weren't going to kick him out. We weren't going to put him on the street. And we were not equipped. And there was nowhere for us to get equipped. And I thought, this is such a dichotomy that we're being told that in the treatment of a disease, we should let him figure it out at 15 years of age. And that's why we started the organization, because we really felt that parents were hungry for information, education, guidance. And so, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but it's more than just support. And support groups are great. They're one piece of the puzzle. But I needed actual tools and skills, having grown up in a family where we suffered and there was no communication. And I was, I had a lot of activation when my son presented with substance use, because I grew up in a very unsafe environment, didn't know what I didn't know. I did not know what I didn't know. And at this point, I'm going to pause for just a minute here, and I want to qualify a couple things. So I speak a lot. I speak out a lot on Facebook. I sort of call out, some of these mantras and ideology, and I do it to propel people towards thriving and life, and to kind of get them to think differently. My intention is never to shame anyone for doing it wrong or bad or different or whatever judgment they might put on themselves. So we're here because we're all trying to do the best that we can with the information that we have. And I didn't know differently, so I did the best that I could at the time. There were things that we did that caused harm. And so, my heart really is to just help people to sort of think outside the traditional box of how we walk through substance use with our loved ones, and to challenge the ideology of, and especially with professionals, providers, therapists, people who are perpetuating the stigma and the stigmatizing language of addiction, and that to let them know that there are different ways that might work for you. So that's why I never want anyone to feel bad. And I don't want you to feel like you have to apologize for what you did or how you've walked through this. So I just want to put that out there right now. I also work with the living. Even though my son has passed, I'm not a grief counselor, I'm not a grief person. And so for someone who lost their loved one, it might evoke a little bit of discomfort because they might feel like their person died because they didn't do this. My person died and I did do this. So, again, like, we're not here to make anyone feel bad or guilty, but we are here to challenge some paradigms and think about this a lot differently. Our learning objectives, I'm not going to go through that. You'll catch those as we go. So first of all, I want to get a little feedback from you. How many of you are family members that have someone using substances or did use substances? Okay, and how many of you work with people that have loved ones experiencing substance use disorder? A lot of you. Okay, so what do you think families feel? Oh, that's cut off for some reason, but what do they feel? What did you feel? What are some of the things that were hard? Yeah. Hopeless. Okay, shout them out. Just popcorn. Frustration. Blame. Insecurity, right? I must be doing it wrong, right? Anger, right? You feel shame. Say that again. Yeah. All of these things. You feel isolated. You feel done, right? Like, I don't know what to do anymore, so I'm just going to check out. I'm done. You might feel afraid. Grief is a big one that we feel, that loss of dreams and ideas and expectations that we have, and you might feel unsupported. So when a loved one's presenting with substance use, what were some of the things, or what are some of the things you hear that parents think about this? Like, what are some thoughts that they might have? It's my fault? It's never going to end? Anybody else? Right? Where do I go for help? There's no resources available. The system's broken. They're super frustrated. Right? How can I fix it? Right? And then also, even about their person, how could they do this to me? Right? She's just and this is, so I used to lurk in the Facebook support groups. And I had to stop because it was so toxic. But you see this all the time. Oh, if their lips are moving, right, then they're lying. They're just manipulators. How could they do this to their child? How could they do this to their husband? There's so much pain, and they really don't know how to think about this. But it feels very personal, doesn't it? At times, it really does. And then what do you think they hear from others? How many treatment centers? Right. What did you do wrong? Yeah, the advice, right? Like, maybe you should just do this, right? Yeah, right. If it was my kid, I wouldn't be tolerating that, right? Yeah, we hear all of those things. It's a choice. It's sin. Maybe if you prayed harder, right? Or you're labeled. Well, you're just codependent, or you're just an enabler. I've had so many people call me sobbing because someone told them that in a not very kind and effective way, right? Or maybe you just have to let go. There's nothing you can do, or just go to a meeting, right? In fact, from my life experience, it was very similar where, I went to a group. The first group I went to, it just wasn't for me. And the second group, I had two choices. I could either go to a you're in recovery from an addiction group, or you're in a codependent group. And I was like, well, that kind of stinks because I wasn't either. Technically I consider myself in recovery from the effects, but at the time I was like, there wasn't any place for me. There just was not any place for me. Little bit of the data. You guys have seen this whole weekend, so I'm going to just quickly go through this. But I argue that families are the most underserved population in the country. When you think about the data, 23 million people are impacted by addiction. Every person that's addicted has loved ones, 3, 4, 5 loved ones that peripherally are affected. If you do the math, that's close to 100 million people, right? And they're not engaged in help. In fact, there's an interesting little statistic. Google says that about 350,000 people a week go to some kind of support group meeting when they're impacted by addiction. 350,000, and we have 80 million people impacted. Why? Why are they not getting the help that they need? Now, what we talk about is creating a recovery-oriented ecosystem, and you guys know the analogy, right? You have a rainforest, and the rainforest, the whole rainforest has gotten sick, and there's this one tree, and you're gonna nurse this tree back to life, so you take it out of the rainforest, and you get it well, and then you put it back in the rainforest that's sick. What happens to the tree? The tree gets sick again, right? So our work as an organization that provides one-on-one peer coaching and educational workshops and connection to resources is to help create a recovery-oriented ecosystem. Now, we use the language that's put forth by SAMHSA, the recovery community themselves. And you'll hear this through the threads. Treatment is not recovery. The 12 steps isn't even necessarily recovery. Support groups are one piece of recovery, but having a whole ecosystem that is orientated towards recovery is an entirely different kind of system. It might mean for me that I'm going to be sober. It might mean for me that I am going to go to support groups, but it also might mean lots of other things that we're going to talk about here. Now, why do families matter? Of course, I'm speaking to the choir here. I'm singing to the choir. You guys are all here because you know that families matter. But this, I think, is, if you look at the social determinants of health, 90% of them are environmental. Only 10% is potentially genetic. And in substance use, there's not even really a clear genetic marker for substance use. There's some genetic threads, but it's not like, the gene for Alzheimer or the gene for breast cancer. There's no really clear genetic connection. We know that there are patterns in families, and those patterns can be passed down. So we look a lot at the generational patterns. But all of these other things make it really clear that social-emotional family systems are really critical to someone who's activating treatment and recovery. We know that families are the most important person in the management of an illness. Now, I talk a lot about this when you think about someone who goes in the hospital because they've had a diabetic episode. And when they're going to go back home, do you think that they go to the wife and say, you just have to let go of him. You just have to let him figure it out yourself. No, they're engaged. I have a friend who's in recovery. Her daughter was presenting at 18 with an eating disorder, and they had family-based therapy, FBT, and the whole family was engaged in the system of care for this daughter that had an eating disorder. They never once told this mom that she should not be involved in the person's care, because they know that families are important in the proper care of the entire family. They also have a clear picture of the individual symptoms. And I'm working with a mom whose son has been in the ER every single day for the last 2 months. He's presenting with physical issues, substance use issues, mental health issues. Every single bit of it is documented, so that when he goes to the next place, and now I think he's going to be placed today in a long-term program, she is the one that has the accurate history, because he doesn't know where he was one day to the next, right? They pass down health-related beliefs. So we see that these beliefs are passed down. You see families where, there are really wonderful health-related beliefs and activities. Our family, we're a family where we're outdoors all the time. We all climb mountains, like high, big, tall mountains. And that's part of our family culture. But then there's also some of those negative things that we see passed on as well. Sedentary behaviors, video gaming, maybe unhealthy nutritional habits. So we know that those habits are passed on, and so when a family works on that together, it makes such a huge difference. They care the most. They stand to gain the most in recovery. Someone was saying, how many treatment centers have they gone to? How much has this cost me? I have a lot to gain. I have a lot to gain emotionally, physically, environmentally, monetarily, and they have the most contact with their loved ones. So here's an interesting bit of data. These are studies that were done by Judith Landau. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she does a lot of work in generational trauma and historical trauma. And they did a study that showed that 80% of kids that have SUD live with their adults. Now think about that, right? 80%. Do you know what kind of influence that means for the family? And 65% of kids that have opiate use disorder are in connection with their family every single day, as opposed to 9% of healthy children. So they compared adult children that did not have SUD with adult children that did, and the difference was that 65% are in connection with their family every day. Now, I know y'all are thinking right now, well, that's because they want money, or that's because they need help. But if we can leverage that, this is the work that we have to do and get to do, is let's leverage that for the health and well-being of the entire family. And this is really a great bit of data that Judith found, that at the end of a year, when the family was engaged in the recovery process, meaning once a week minimum communications meetings, constant connection, part of the recovery plan, part of the recovery process, at the end of a year, 71% of those kids were still in recovery or had reduced use, 71%. And we know that the rate of reoccurrence in substance use is so high. So this is really an important piece of data. So for us, what we do, and I'm just going to share kind of our experience and how we just received a grant from the Department of Human Services in Minnesota to provide family peer support based on some of the work that we're doing. And we have a 4-step process: evaluate, regulate, educate, and then collaborate. So every one of those pieces is really important. Starts with evaluate. Where are they at in their own perception of their health and well-being? So we have tools that we use. We have the name of it is called the happiness scale, and it's CRAFT, Community Reinforcement, Robert Myers measurement tool to see how satisfied they are with their life. And then we have a modified BARC scale. So if you're familiar with recovery, it's called a brief assessment of recovery capital. And so we really talk about building recovery capital. We're going to add things to our recovery bucket so that our scale weighs way higher in the recovery side of things than in the non-recovery side of things. And then one of the things that we do is talk about the 8 dimensions of wellness. How do you see yourself? This is all self-directed, person-centered. So tell me about what you feel like your need is right now. Where do you feel like you're at on a scale from 1 to 5 in your area of financial well-being? Or how do you feel emotionally right now on a scale from 1 to 5? Occupationally, are you showing up for work? Is your environment safe? So we go through all of these things and help them score to see where they need to do the most work. Maybe they're lacking maybe their job is great, but they're lacking in community. Maybe one of the things that they've given up was their physical workouts. And so we're just gonna, recovery defined, there's a couple of definitions in the dictionary, and one is a return to health and well-being. And so when we talk about recovery for the family, we frame it that way. Some people get a little afraid of the word recovery, so we're just going to help you return to your standard of health and well-being. And what does that look like for you? Maybe for somebody, for physical well-being, they're a 2, but maybe that's okay with them. And they were a 1, and now they're a 2, and they don't need to work on that. So we're going to help them identify goals. And then the next thing we do is help them identify values. You know, who do you want to be? Like, part of the reason why this is so important is, in most cases, what we view, how we value ourselves and how we're showing up are 2 different things. You know, I want to show up present, consistent, kind, compassionate, and I'm not, because I'm dysregulated, activated, I have trauma, you know, that's present right now. And so what we find, and this is, you know, people come to us and they're like, whoops, oh my gosh, hold on. Sorry. People come to us and they're like, I am not who I want to be in this situation, and I need to make some changes. What does that look like? And they don't know what to do. And then finally, again, we take a person-centered approach. So for regulate, some of you guys might be familiar with you know, practices like DBT, distress tolerance, but really what it boils down to is that and I know that this is true with both mental illness and substance use, but sometimes the behaviors associated with someone in active use can be harmful. So people are trying to protect themselves. And that's one of the things we always acknowledge and validate is yes, this is hard and it is causing harm. And you're in a trauma, when you're activated, you're in a trauma response. You're in your lower brain. You're in your fight or flight. Flight, or freeze. So I can't make a logical, rational decision about how I want to interact with my person if I'm in that lower brain, if I'm in a trauma response. So what we want to try to do is get them, and how many of you guys have helplines or, you know, take phone calls from families? Right. When they call, how are they? They're distraught, right? How are they when they call you? Usually overwhelmed, right? If they're feeling bad enough to make a phone call, they're feeling really bad, right? Because it's such a brave and courageous thing to even pick up the phone and ask for help, that you know that if they're calling, they need help and they're not in a good place. And they're probably really in their lower brain, flight, fight, freeze. They don't know what to do. So the first thing we want to do is try to get them calmed down. You know, and often it's asking them what's worked for them. Like, how are you making decisions right now? You know, what are your practices to stay mindful? What are the ways that you find help you to keep your feet grounded, to stay in a place of balance? So we'll ask them. And then oftentimes, as you know, they don't know. Like, I have no idea. So we're going to maybe offer some suggestions. Do you like music? Do you like to walk? There's a space between, this is a really great quote, there's a space between stimulus and response, and that's where our superpower lies, right? That's where our power lies, is how we respond to things. And you can't respond if you're in your lower brain. So, well, you can. It just may not be effective. So we want to get them up here, thinking logically, rationally, intentionally. And then we want to go back to clarifying some of those values. Now, you told me last week that what was really important for you is to be able to respond in a way that honored the person, that honored your son. What would that look like right now? I don't even know. Okay, then let's take some time. Nothing's going to change in the next hour. Let's take some time and let's think about that, right? What are some practices? The pause is just a big skill, as you know. And then for us, you know, we really talk about it as way of being and having a heart of peace towards your person. There's a book that we give our parents called The Anatomy of Peace, and it's written by the Arbinger Institute, and it's really about how we view other people, and I'm going to talk about that more in just a minute. And then we help educate our loved ones. So let me just see if yeah, okay. And this is where we get into some of the meat and potatoes. And the education isn't just, this is what substance use is, right? Although that is part of it. But the first thing we look at is language, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. I'm going to go through a few of these in more detail, but this is kind of the summary slide here. So the first thing we do is we talk about language and why language matters, okay? And in our organization, we always use the person-centered language that was put out by Faces and Voices of Recovery. So we don't use terms that are stigmatizing. And this is really an important part of what I usually try to share with families, is especially with substance use. That, and we talk a lot about the war on drugs, right? We have been conditioned as a society to think in terms of good and bad, black and white, sober, not sober. And when we think in terms of black and white, us versus them, good versus bad, clean versus dirty, we're dehumanizing the person in front of us. That you can never, and it's created by this war on drugs, right? So the war on drugs is a war on people. And so when someone presents with substance use, we're in a war. And you see these words all the time. It's a battle. We've got to win the battle. And all the words that are used in our society around substance use evoke a power differential. And as long as there's a power differential, we're not working collaboratively or person-centered at all. And so helping families to understand their own intrinsic biases and their heart of war. And I tell this story to just drive home this point a little bit, because one of the great things I did for my recovery is join a book club. And it's gotten me out of, reading every book I could about substance use disorder, and now I get to read really great fiction. And I read this book a while back called Beartown. Really great book if you never read it, and now there's a movie about it on Hulu or HBO or something. And there was a quote in here, and I was like, whoa, this is really good. I got to use this in my talk to drive home this point. But the setup of this is in a small town in the Black Forest of Norway. It's very remote, but hockey is everything. Hockey is their life, and they are getting a contract to build a new hockey center in their town. Biggest thing that's ever happened to their town, because they have a hockey player that's very skilled. Well, the hockey player rapes a girl and is accused of rape, and the girl speaks out with the support of her parents. And of course, as you can imagine, it was not taken well in the town. And so the town was split. The people that believed her versus the people that believed the hockey player, and had a lot to lose because of this accusation. And so there was this sort of conflict and war that started rising in this community. And when I work with families, they will say, of course they love their person, but their heart is not a heart of love. And it comes out of protection. So here is the little snippet from this book that drives this home. Hate can be a deeply stimulating emotion. The world becomes much easier to understand and much less terrifying if you divide everything and everyone into friends and enemies, we and they, good and evil, good or bad. The easiest way to unite a group isn't through love, but because love is hard. It makes demands. Hate is simple. So the first thing that happens in a conflict is that we choose a side, because that's easier than trying to hold two thoughts in our head at the same time. The second thing that happens is that we seek out facts that confirm what we want to believe, right? Confirmation bias. Comforting facts, ones that permit us to go on with life as normal. The third is that we dehumanize our enemy, and there are many ways of doing that, but none is easier than taking away their name. And so we use language like addict and alcoholic. We use words like clean and dirty. We use words like liar, manipulator, thief. And those words perpetuate that protection that families have. And I would say they're never intentionally trying to hate on their person. But love is hard when there are behaviors that are creating some problems, right? It's hard to love. And one of the first ways we start this is by taking away the labels that are associated with that stigma. So we use person with substance use disorder, positive or negative, withdrawal management rather than detox, recovery, and then for families, they're shamed just as much. Again, so we don't use terms like codependent or enabler. I mean, codependent's not really a thing on the DSM. And we believe families were created to be interdependent. We find the phrase tough love problematic because generally there's a certain action that goes along with that, which is I'm going to cut my person off. Tough love is I'm going to kick them out. And a lot of times it's because we don't know what else to do. In fact, in one of the talks yesterday, it was such a good talk on PACS and communicating in a peaceful communication. And they said, you know, when we don't know what to do and feel ill-equipped, we just check out. And so a lot of times that's what's behind some of those behaviors. And we really want our families to think about how they can create connection in spite of the difficult circumstances that they're going through. So we also work to debunk some of the myths that are out there, and these are common things that you hear all the time. Substance use is a choice. Now, I hope those of you who are professionals working in the field understand this. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the neuroscience of this, but this is something that there's a really great video put out by the Center for Motivation and Change about behaviors that make sense. So the substance use isn't the problem. The substance use is the solution and for whatever the problem is. And helping families understand this, that your loved one's behaviors make just as much sense as you going to the refrigerator when you're bored, right? Or you having a glass of wine at the end of the day. Or you sitting on the TV, you know, watching mindless reality TV every night, right? Your behaviors make sense. When I feel stressed, I can do this, and then I don't feel stressed anymore, right? And helping them understand that this is what's going on with their loved one. And we even engage in an exercise with them to help them sort of identify maybe why, you know, and then create conversation around that. So when my son was 13 and didn't feel like he fit in, he could take a toke from a bud, and all of a sudden he had all kinds of friends, right? When your loved one can't sit still and they need to get homework done, they can take an Adderall, and boom, they're straight A students. So the substances are working for them, and we have to understand that. Because, of course, once addiction is activated, it looks like it's not working for them anymore. But initially it was. And then it becomes a pattern. And that's where the idea of the neuroscience and explaining to them that these are deeply entrenched patterns of behavior that actually can be broken. And explaining how the neural pathways work and what the neuroscience is. this is another myth. People only change through negative consequences. Now, certainly there is a little bit of truth to the fact that if my pants start getting too tight, I'm going to start exercising more because I'm uncomfortable. So yes, we do change through discomfort. But one of the things that I've seen in every single talk that I've been to this weekend is about how we can reinforce and reward positive behaviors, which is pretty common with mental health issues, but it is revolutionary in substance use. People take a punitive approach. If they do this, then I'll punish them this way. Everybody always calls me and says, what consequences can I give? What they think boundaries are punishment, so they have a mistake about, a misconception about what boundaries are. What boundaries can I set? How can I get them? How can I really basically manipulate them to change? And the truth is what we can do is we can reinforce positive behaviors, because human beings respond to reinforcement, and we help them understand that you can either negatively reinforce your person's behaviors. Here's an example, right? Your person comes in and you see that they have red eyes. And the next thing you know, you're in a knockdown, drag out, all out fight about it, right? Without asking, without clarifying, without getting any information, you've confronted them, you've yelled at them, and you're, why did you go out and smoke when you told me you weren't gonna? Right? And then you find out there were swimming at the swimming pool. But what you've done, and if they were smoking, you've reinforced the negative behavior, right? And your brain gets dopamine hits from that chaos, from the negative arguments. So I'm reinforcing all these negative behaviors, and when I challenge families, I'm like, if your list of positive reinforcements aren't way bigger than your list of natural consequences, then you're thinking wrong here. Like, let's make the first list. And what's so interesting is when we get parents engaged in looking at the positives and trying to think about what they can reinforce in a positive way, it changes their neural pathways as well. Now all of a sudden they're looking for the good. Let's catch our person doing right and good instead of always doing wrong. Myth 3, families should practice tough love and detachment. And, again, we understand that oftentimes it's because they just don't know what else to do. Or maybe it's because someone's told them that that's what they need to do. And so we find some different, these are different ways to, that families feel, why they feel compelled to disconnect. And a lot of times it's their own trauma. They grew up in homes where it wasn't safe, and they feel unsafe. And one of the things that we try to do is really help them feel safe, creating safe spaces for the family members. Healing happens in safe spaces, and if you're not safe, you can't heal. They've been told by professionals that they have to do this. They don't have any other tools or skills. Now and I know this is really a phrase you guys have heard a lot. I just had the honor of chatting with Johan Hari just the other day. He was at a conference and we had a talk, exchanged emails. It was pretty cool. But he wrote the book Lost Connections, right? So he did the rat pack experiments where, when the rats they had two choices. They could have water or cocaine water, and when they were alone, they always went for the cocaine water. But when they were with all the other rats and they had all the stuff that the rats had, they never went for the cocaine water, or only rarely did. They drank the regular water. And so what happens in substance use is that we tell families to detach and disconnect, and it drives substance use. They're doing the very thing because when you are using substances, you're creating attachments. It works on the amygdala, and you get this warm, fuzzy feeling. And now your family's creating chaos, arguing, you're at war, right? They don't want you around. So what are you going to attach to? You're going to attach to the people that accept you, which are your drug-using friends, and you're going to attach to the substance itself because it releases endorphins and dopamine and gives you that warm feeling. So we really work with families to help recreate connection, because without being connected, you have absolutely no influence in that person's life. Now, we do that carefully. We are not reckless with that. We never advocate for a person being unsafe, right? But even if you're separated physically, your person is in a different place, they're on the street, and I'll give you an example, because this comes up a lot. My person is on the street, and they're hungry. Should I give them food? Now, how many people you know would say, don't ever give them food, that's enabling, right? Now, I have a little bit of a problem with that, myself personally, but what I'll do is I'll say, what's the intention behind that? And so if you want to create connection, don't buy them DoorDash, but go pick them up and take them to dinner. Pick them up and take them to get groceries. Go with them to the place where they're serving meals at the Lutheran church on the corner. Pick them up and take them to get a meal, because now you're feeding them physically and you're feeding their soul by connecting with them. And do it in small doses so that you can manage that. And of course, it takes preparation. I have to be in my wise mind. I have to be regulated. I have to know what I'm getting into. I keep my wallet and my checkbook and my credit cards at home. And I go and I pick them up and I find a place for them to shower, to have a warm meal. I buy them groceries, and then I have to drop them back off at the homeless shelter and go back home. But it's still creating connection. Do you see the difference? Right? So we don't want to have this blanket like, don't talk to them when they're not sober, right? Because that's conditional. That's conditional. That's not, we're all about meeting people where they're at. Okay, understanding how change works. People hitting rock bottom. Like rock bottom last year was death for 107,000 people, right? Robert Myers, who does craft, says, F rock bottom. I won't say the word. He's like, that's that. No other disease that you treat would say, wait, we're not going to treat you until you have the widowmaker heart attack, right? Nope, you don't get to come get treated for that fracture until your bone's so broken that it's sticking out of your body. Like, that's ridiculous. But in substance use, that is what people are told. Let your person hit rock bottom. When early intervention produces significantly better outcomes, right? And people think they're doing a favor by letting them hit rock bottom. So we help them understand the stages of change. And that's a really important piece of the work that we do. How do people change? And guess what? You have the power to move someone through the stages of change, to help facilitate that. And we teach them how to use validation skills. The funnest thing we get to do is teach them about change talk. If you're familiar with like motivational interviewing, and when they're in the contemplation stage, how do you listen for those words that say, maybe I'm thinking about making a change, and how you can catch them in that and then ask open-ended questions. So, I'm really sick of waking up every morning with a headache. Wow, that does sound really hard. Like, what do you think that's from? Tell me more about that headache. Like, did you do something different last night? Not, firing questions at them, but just some options of ways that they can engage that conversation to get the person to self-discover, right? We believe in doing with, so someone says, and this is another one that we work really hard to have the families, like sometimes when someone's in active use, it's hard to even pick up the phone, and we hear this all the time, is don't help them, let them figure it out for themselves, right? Well, and I'll just give you a really quick story. I love stories. This drives home the point. A family called. Well, they actually had been They hadn't had a conversation with their son for almost a year, and he ended up in jail. They had been told to detach and disconnect and let the kid figure it out. So he's 24 years old. He's in jail, in the county jail, and they put him on Suboxone because he had opiate use disorder. And he started calling him because he started, the medication was working, right? He wasn't in withdrawal anymore. He was doing better. He called his mom and dad. Mom and dad engaged that conversation. So good to hear from you. How are you doing? And through that connection, he ends up getting extradited to a small county jail. They wouldn't prescribe him Suboxone, and they didn't have iPads. He couldn't even make a call to activate any kind of help once he got out of jail. So had this family left this kid to figure it out for himself, he would have released from jail, off Suboxone, 1,000 times more risk for overdose, and he would have been dead in 48 hours. But this mom and dad came alongside this kid, and I helped them, and we got him a bed and treatment, a virtual appointment for Suboxone. They got the script, they put him in the car, and 3 hours later, he was in treatment. And if they would have followed everybody else's advice, it would have been just let him figure it out himself. And this is the culture that we live in when it comes to substance use disorder. And what's interesting is when people start doing this, their loved ones respond to it. They respond. They want to be treated with value. And our guiding principles are, unconditional positive regard. Like, first and foremost, every person that you come in contact with is worthy of unconditional positive regard, right? There's nothing you can do. And this is where our collaborative skills come in. And I'm not sure what time it is. We're getting close to, but we equip them with actual things that they can do, right? Skills. So in community reinforcement and family training, there's something called a functional analysis that we fill out with the family. What triggers your person's use? When do they usually use? How often are they using? What's perpetuating the use? And then the idea is, and craft, the data behind community reinforcement and family training, the studies that were done where they were 4 times more effective in helping someone get into treatment than an intervention or Al-Anon. They are an intervention. And at the end of a year, 65% of the families that were studied, their loved ones went into treatment or were in treatment. So it's a great way to equip families to help engage their loved one into getting help. And so we help them identify when they're using, kind of interrupt that process sometimes when they can, so that they recognize the triggers. We believe in motivational interviewing, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. Equipping them with how to listen better, how to have more collaborative conversations. Of course, we ask the family members to do their own recovery work, which might mean their own therapist. Some support groups, doesn't have to be 12-step. Like, there's plenty of different kinds of groups out there. And I'm going to go into a couple of these quickly before we wrap up here. But this is the actionable solutions, right? And for those of you, some of you might be familiar with motivational interviewing and our peer support training. You have to learn this. And it was when all of the light bulbs went off for me, was that I can learn to use these skills to communicate with my loved one. We call them the superpowers because they really are superpowers and they work. Every single person wants to feel seen and heard and validated. And we help them figure out how they can validate and affirm their loved ones without condoning the behaviors. That's the biggest hurdle for families, is if I validate my person, am I not condoning what they're doing? I'm like, nope, it's totally different. You're just validating their experience. Like, you're just telling them that you're walking with them and that you're trying to understand what they're going through. So we role play in our groups and in our educational workshops. Role play and practice is a fundamental component of working with families in this way. So having scenarios, dyads. Tell me about a specific situation that you're going through right now, and let's come up with some skills-based language and practice that, right? So how can you validate? They've called you 12 times today. They want $10 because they said they have a flat tire. How can you use these skills to overcome that situation? Wow, that sounds really hard. What I heard you say is that your tire's flat on the interstate again today. That's probably really difficult. What I love that I heard is that you want to get to work on time. And one thing I know about you is you're very conscientious about your work. That's amazing. Tell me more about what happened. And when you get into those open-ended questions, this is where sometimes magic happens, because that's where they can't come up with the lies fast enough. And so all of a sudden they back off. Oh, where exactly do you have that flat tire? Where are you? Maybe I can come and help you. How about if I call AAA? No, it's fine, Mom. Right? So it's great skills to kind of weed out and sift out what's really happening. And, sometimes they really aren't being forthright. But by asking those clarifying questions, those are who, how, why, when, we cue families, I'm curious. I'm wondering. Can you tell me more? I'm trying to understand. Those are words, phrases that are lead-ins to asking those open-ended questions that are so effective. Now what I heard you say was that you loved the way marijuana made you feel. I'm wondering if you can tell me more about that. Right? Tell me about that. But you have to say it in a non-judgmental way, right? I have to be curious. It's all about how you say it, not what you say. And then we get into listening for that change talk. I talked about that a little bit already. So, and then gaining consent. This is a big one. Never, ever offering advice unless you have permission, right? So are you just venting, or do you want some feedback? Are you interested in my thoughts, or do you just want to talk about this? Right? I'm here for you if all you want to do is vent. That's fine. I'll listen. It's okay, right? But never, ever offer. We use this in our groups. No teaching, preaching, wouldying, coulding, or shoulding all over anybody, right? So because that's the language that causes harm and causes disconnection. Well, you just need to. You just have to. You must. When we tell someone what to do, it activates their rebellion. And so, most of these kids, if you tell them what to do, they'll do the absolute opposite. And 90% of the time, they feel like they have lost their power. So we're giving them just a little bit of power back by helping them to resolve their own problems or figure things out. We have a process, we call it the 4 F's of setting boundaries. One of the biggest things we have to do with working with our families is even telling them what boundaries are, because they think boundaries are rules and punishment that manipulate a person to hit rock bottom, rather than safety fences that help me stay safe so I can love you well. Brene Brown has the best video on this. The most loving, compassionate, kind people that I've had the privilege of being around are the people with the most boundaries. When I'm well boundaried, so I can sleep at night, eat well, keep my financial well-being, take care of myself emotionally, then I can love you almost till the ends of the earth. Like, I can give infinitively if I have good boundaries. Yeah. Oh, no, teaching, preaching, wouldying, coulding, or shoulding all over anybody. We're just going to finish this up really quick. Contingency management, right? That's a process in recovery. People are using it. It's gamifying recovery, and it's highly effective. And basically, we're rewarding. So a small picture of contingency management is 12-step coins, right? If I go to this meeting, I get my 30-day, then I get my 60-day, then I get my 3-month and 4-month and whatever, right? I'm rewarding, I'm pinging a brain for reaching a certain level. And these kids that have grown up on video games, I mean, they'll play till 3 o'clock in the morning just so they can get that reward and get more coin cash to buy the houses for their Minecraft village, right? It's so effective. And if we apply those principles to recovery, I'm going to look for the good, but I'm also going to reinforce your work that you're doing. And even in active use, and I know I got to wrap up quick soon here, but a couple other stories that I want to tell in this one. Mom's son on the streets in LA, swallowed up by the homeless community, and he started going to the social worker's office. The social worker called mom in Minnesota, so mom and the social worker got into cahoots, and she started sending Subway gift cards. So every time that kid would go into the social worker's office, he got a gift card. Guess how much he came in? He showed up every single week until they could get him back home, and now he's 4 years in recovery because of Subway gift cards. That's how effective that was. And it's really effective in recovery. So we're going to reinforce it's the stars, you guys, the stars that the teachers give. And if you get so many stars, and actually it was in the talk that I just went in, the PACS talk on peaceful communications, and they're like random rewards. So they don't know, they can't manufacture it because they don't know exactly when they're going to get it, but it's randomized. So if they accumulate 10 different, recovery activities, or they go to therapy 10 different times, then when we go to therapy on the 10th time, we're going to stop and we're going to get, a Starbucks or whatever. They can be simple, they can be financial, they can be, know your person's love language, right? And what is meaningful to them. And then, of course, we really talk a lot about harm reduction strategies in our organization. Dead people can't recover. How do you keep people alive? And if they think Suboxone is going to work for them, then let's just support that. I don't care what you think about Suboxone. If he thinks it's going to work for him, set your ideas aside and let him try it, right? And then just coming alongside of them, making sure that if they are using, and that's really counterintuitive for families, I'm going to make sure that they have sterile needles so that they don't get Hep C or HIV. I'm going to make sure that they always have naloxone, right? Even kids going to a party these days should have naloxone. And those are hard conversations for parents to have because, again, it feels like you're condoning it or you're being counterintuitive. But another really great story, finish quickly, but Cindy's, had been told by a support group that she was going to that she should just leave her son be, let him hit rock bottom. He was a vet, he was on the streets, and then one day he disappeared, and they couldn't find him, and she was like, I can't do this anymore. I've got to do something different. And she had been plugged into the Thrive community, so when he popped up, what she decided to do was every week meet him at the Circle K gas station, and they would go to the park. And she just met him every week at the park. And he showed up fairly, managed in his use at the park, and he started really enjoying those visits. Eventually, they introduced the niece and the nephew because he loved his niece and nephew. And they did that for about 3 months. And finally, Jared said, Mom, I think I need help. And in the meantime, she had researched. They had tried lots of other things, so he went on methadone, did ketamine treatments. She let him come back and live with him, which was very difficult for her, not because of him, but because everyone else had told her not to do that. And anyway, he's 3 years in recovery, rides his bike all around the United States. But it was very non-traditional. It was not a typical pathway. She had stopped insisting on abstinence. Because if we take that black and white, clean or dirty, good or bad, and these kids that are using opiates and they can't be abstinent, their brains are not developed enough and they need to be on Suboxone. And the parents are insisting on abstinence and they die. And they die because of it. Because they have people in their life that are telling them that if they're on Suboxone, they're not really sober. Right? And they die. So just in summary, that is how we set up a family for recovery, creating a recovery-oriented ecosystem. And I'm going to try to make it through this very last slide. I might have to take a drink. And I want to caveat this with my son was on medications, but he did have a 48-hour relapse, and he passed away. But what this gave us was what I call Lazarus time, so bear with me if you're not a person of faith or religious. I'll tell you the story, just try to take it in the context of what it is. But my son started using at the age of 12, and at the age of 20, he activated what was before that. It was about 19, he activated recovery. And we were sitting in front of a pastor one day, and he looked at us, and he said, are you going to be right for the sake of justice, or are you going to love for the sake of relationship? Because love never fails. Are you going to be right for the sake of justice? And we knew we had to do something different. And so because of the work we did, because of the work that our family did, we got what we call Lazarus time. And I'll just explain it, is that in the New Testament, there's a story about a man named Lazarus. And Lazarus and Jesus were really good friends. They were good buddies. And Lazarus died. And his family came to Jesus and said, will you raise Lazarus from the dead? You're doing it for everybody else. Can you come and raise him from the dead? And so Jesus went and raised Lazarus from the dead. And you know what they don't say in there, and they don't explain, is that ultimately Lazarus died for real. Like, he died for all eternity. But the gift that Jesus gave the family was the time from when Lazarus was raised from the dead till the time Lazarus died. And what we got was we got to be raised from the dead. Right? We got really good years with our son, even when he was using. We had good moments with him. We took him out to the mountains, and the first couple of days he would detox, and it would be really hard, and then he would be himself. And we spent time with him even when we knew he was in a relapse. But we knew we had to continue to connect with him, and our love couldn't be conditional. And 2 years ago, he brought me up to my first summit of a 14er. And we had this time with him that was such a gift. And I know that had we followed the advice of the people who told us to cut him off and not have anything to do with him until he got sober, we would not have had those amazing years. And I look back and I wouldn't have done a thing different. He was an amazing human being. And this is what we need to give our families. We need to tell them that it's possible to have Lazarus time if we do our work. So with that, I will say thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening to what we're doing with the families. My contact information is here. This is our organization, and we're grateful to just, if anybody wants any information, the slide deck is in the Whova app. And I don't know if anybody has questions. I know it's time to go, and I want you guys to be able to leave, but if anybody wants to stick around and ask some questions, or I don't know, Tony, if there's any questions on Zoom, I'm happy to just chat with you at the end here. So thank you very much for being willing to hear how we can help families a little different. So appreciate anybody have any questions or